theoretical question. How do they have the cheek? How do they have the nerve to pretend that their account of theory is all the theory that matters? Where does that arrogance come from? And part of what strikes me in relation to that, this is the end of the polemic part, you'll be pleased to hear, it's the introduction, is the doctrine used in colonizing Australia, the doctrine of terra nullius, that Australia, when the white people came, didn't belong to anybody, it was no one's land. And therefore Europeans could arrive and parcel out the land. Much the same is what has happened to theorizing social movements, that if you pick up a standard textbook about social movements, you get an account in which there are no natives, in which social movement actors, but also Europeans, Latin Americans, Asians, never really had anything to say about this, except to the extent that a handful of really famous ones have impinged on some people in New York and California. So I think there's a little bit of an intellectual problem there. There are political aspects to it, but it's an intellectual weakness as well, to arrogate to oneself, we are social movement theory. So that's the target in some ways of this book. And the goal is to have, I suppose, a broader conception of social movement, which doesn't limit it to a single kind of level of activity. And in particular, one which takes movement seriously, in that what social movements are trying to do, they often don't succeed, but what they're trying to do is to move. They are not trying to stay in the business as usual space, which is neatly defined by doing a particular set of routines. They're actually trying to get beyond that. They are trying to reshape the conditions of their own existence. They don't always get there, of course, but knowing that they can get there is fundamental to their activity, and the movement, the moments in which they do get there, are arguably absolutely central to our history. So a notion of social movement which doesn't, by definition, confine them to a very narrow space on a social jigsaw is quite important. It enables a broader dialogue with other disciplines, and I'm going to suggest as well a theoretical dialogue with movements, because it is by no means evident to me that we have much justification when we assert the intellectual power of our particular constructs vis-a-vis movements. It's something that would have to be demonstrated. Of course, the canonical model is about removing oneself from having to demonstrate that. But I think much is lost intellectually as well as politically in not having the broader kinds of dialogues with practitioners that only a few decades back were absolutely standard in much of the field. So, let's start now with some more constructive thoughts about social movements and social theory. Historically, certainly in the English-speaking world, which is what I can speak to, social movements have actually contributed rather a lot to the development of social theory. This is true not just in a figure like Marx, it's true rather differently in the problematics that people like Weber and Durkheim, with their very different political engagements, were struck by, were trying to understand and grapple with, even while they were making a political separation between their work and their wider politics. It's also true, of course, for the huge revival of social theory since the 1960s, the arrival within the academy of themes placed there not only by Marxists, but by feminists, post-colonial scholars, gay, queer, and so on and so forth, asking different kinds of questions. So movements have offered social theory rather a lot. The same is not always true in reverse. Bevington and Dixon noted 10 years back now, social movement activists very rarely read social movement theory. And arguably, they're right not to. It's not hugely movement relevant. There's a good reason why it's not movement relevant, is that it's not produced in dialogue with movements. It's produced within four walls, and then occasionally attempts are made to disseminate it like Garibaldi and his balloon throwing leaflets to the peasants. It's not a very effective mode of communication. So I think there's an intellectual value to reviving dialogue between movement theorists and researchers. One is that it saves us from being trapped by the logics of our own sociology of knowledge. So from a strong intellectual point of view, it's not good for us intellectually only to be responsible to our own internal subdisciplinary and institutional power and patronage arrangements. That doesn't produce good thinking. It's good for us intellectually to go beyond fragmentation, and it produces a certain kind of intellectual resilience. This is in part the experience that this book comes out of. So it comes out on the one hand of the Interface Journal. Interface is set up as a space for dialogue between movement practitioners and researchers, something which is of course very normal in many fields. It's normal in architecture, it's normal in nursing, it's normal in international relations, it's normal, there's nothing unusual about it, but it has ceased to be so within social movements. And in fact, one of the most important things I think we did when we set it up was to make it open access at a point where most of the other journals were in fact literally not available unless you were in a university or had vast amounts of personal wealth to spend on them. And that's had knock-on effects which are very good to see, because even that simple awareness, when I write, other people can read me and answer back. That makes a difference. But particularly, I think, treating practitioner knowledge seriously, running a peer review process which is not simply two researchers, but is one researcher and one practitioner asking about the intellectual value of what's being said. That shifts the tone. I want to say it shifts it in a strong way, because as Jeffrey said, engaging with practitioner knowledge has nothing to do with celebration. We don't add anything to movements by saying, this movement is happening and it's wonderful. In fact, people do that in academia all the time as pure research. What's useful to movements is to talk with practitioners about what they think they're up to, where they experience the blockages, where they're trying to get to. In other words, to talk to their praxis knowledge, rather than to questions of, is it good, is it bad? We do the same thing in PhD and master's courses with activists. So we work with people who are coming from movements and going back to movements in a process of co-producing knowledge. So in a process of asking them to reflect on, what are they trying to do? Is it working? The relationship between the principles and the practice, and to learn not simply from us as academics, because of course that helps them, but also to learn from each other. And Tuven's method has been quite useful in this, in bringing together different aspects of what you could call the wider social movement, the social movement totality, which typically don't talk to each other. So these are different kind of logics of production of knowledge. We could talk more about those if people are interested. It also raises the question, of course, of what social movement theory can do for movements. I'll skip over our own sort of personal starting points in this to move to the key argument we make here, which is, from a social movement point of view, the most interesting thing about Marxism is not the architecture of Das Kapital. It's the extent to which Marx and Engels' life's work, and that then of serious Marxist thinkers subsequently, has been to try and embody and articulate broader popular learning processes. The processes of the 1848 revolutions, the processes of the Irish struggle. Remember, Engels was living with the Burns sisters, the Chartist movement, trying to understand what was going on in Poland or in the American Civil War or whatever. So what we call very broadly movement-grounded conceptualizations of agency. Now, the relationship between the immensely complex late 19th century production of popular knowledge in movements and the particular version of that that crystallizes out as Marxism, it's not simple, it's not linear. And of course, there are multiple Marxisms and multiple readings of them. That, I think, is not necessarily weakness. Once one thinks that what one is looking at is this popular knowledge refracted. What it does mean is that it's possible for movements today to reclaim some of that ecological slogan, to reclaim, to reuse, to recycle, to use what has become frozen, or if one prefers, sedimented within the academy, and draw from it in dialogue with present-day practical purposes. Of course, that's not a simple process. And of course, as well, it's not unique to Marxism. Most obviously, one could write not a similar book, but I think a very good book about feminism in this same way. How did theories generated within movements and for movement purposes first become, in some ways, so academic, but then what are the processes whereby they acquire life in the movement world? So that kind of dialectic of knowledge is what we're interested in. Secondly, then, in terms of thinking about movement, what we draw out from Marxism for this. Oh, my apologies. The variety of movement experiences, the number of different forms of collective agency that I've been talking about, is extraordinary, and part of a Marxist demand of that is to have an adequate understanding of how that diversity is produced, rather than saying, in the mode of framing theory, for example, well, movements try to operate in this way to get themselves into the mainstream US media or whatever. Say, what is it about that situation? How is that different from the relationship, for example, in Italy, where there is still quite a substantial left media? How is that different from periods in the past where movements have essentially produced their own media? So to understand the institutional conditions of a particular form of movement as our first question. And therefore, I guess also in some ways to demystify theory, to think about social theory in terms of situated, shared, organized agency. So in relation to collective action, and this surprised us when we started working on this, lots of people started to turn around and say, goodness, social movements from above, that's a very interesting concept. Of course, activists in a very wide range of movements have been aware for rather a long time that their opponents act, that it's really important to demystify the action of their opponents, because therefore it shows it is contingent. But also, by demystifying it, it makes it possible to intervene effectively, to detach members from a ruling coalition, and so on and so forth. This is kind of activist ABC, but rather a good argument for talking to movements, I think. Now, in routine periods, in much of the period that we have called neoliberal, for example, the collective agency of the powerful, the wealthy, and the culturally central has been more effective than collective agency from below. That's, in fact, by definition, that is what defines business as usual. That's what defines normality. Yeah? History is not only made of such situations, but certainly a normal period in history is one in which the powerful are relatively unproblematically powerful, and so on. So collective action from above. And the particular kinds of hegemonic relationships that obtain in any such period have a massive effect, of course, on movements from below. The extent to which attempts are made to co-opt them, to repress them, to exclude them, or whatever, very central conditions of movement's action. And this becomes very clear whenever you're at the meeting asking what we should do. People talk about, well, if you do this, We'll meet the police. If we do this, might we be acceptable? Could we frame ourselves? Could we get allies? These kinds of discussions are absolutely normal. But normal periods are not all there is. Right? Moments of crisis reshuffle what is normal, and they do so with relative rapidity. So, skipping slightly forward a bit, when I say to people we're living in the twilight of neoliberalism, sometimes they say, I've heard it all before. But if you think of the succession of different accumulation strategies, simply in Western Europe, since the start of the 20th century, there have been rather a lot of them, yeah? Before neoliberalism, we had Keynesianism. Before Keynesianism, we had fascism. Before fascism, we had a different kind of liberal capitalism, different in Eastern Europe, different in post-colonial states where we had national developmentalist moments. But actually, such things succeed each other with relative rapidity on a longer scale. And I'm going to try and move into a broader discussion of that. It is, if you like, a kind of bifocal perspective. What I'm showing you here is a street view in Berlin from Google Street View in 2014, and in the insert, a moment from the Spartacus uprising in 1919 on the same street corner. And it's to have the ability to see both of those things at once, to see the way in which everyday normality in fact represents kind of frozen agency, or if you prefer, the outcomes from a series of previous struggles, because of course 1919 was an awful lot has happened in East Berlin since 1919. But to understand the production of the everyday normality as social movement actors perceive it in this longer perspective. So how can we historicize what movements are? What we argue in the book is that insofar as we make our own history, but not under conditions of our choosing, the conditions not of our choosing in particular are the outcomes of previous crises and what we call the truce lines. So the point at which the front stopped, so to speak, in whatever the previous crisis was. Now, it's not that attempts aren't made to push that front backwards and forwards, but under normal circumstances, actors do so fairly tentatively and they don't invest very much in it. Moments of organic crisis are precisely moments where substantial numbers of actors, either from above or below, go, actually, we think we could substantially reshape this, and attempt to do so with differing outcomes within which we live. This is, of course, very central to the Marxist sociology of the workplace. Not the discussion of the formal laws, but the discussion in which both the formal laws and the informal custom and practice have to be understood in relation to broader power relations within the workplace, as actors understand them through the way in which they have fought them out last time round. And when they say, I don't think we're going, if the union says, I don't think we're going to try and make a legal case of this because we know in advance where it's going. Or if management say, we can push them on this, but we're not going to try and push them on this because that would actually seriously disrupt the everyday flow of business. That's not purely a feature of workplaces. The broader movement landscapes, then, that we experience develop from those previous crises. And let me explain that a little bit. It's very familiar, of course, that as we move between countries, but also as we move between regions or cities, you experience long-lasting landscapes similar to the concept, let's say, of cleavage structures or party systems. You find that movements in a particular time and place tend to work in such and such a way. And most actors involved are aware of this and have a sense of it and will explain to incomers or people who say, why don't we do what they do in Spain? Well, yes, Spain is fine, but here. Yeah. So this is part of actors' mental worlds. Part of the reason for that difference, of course, is that the outcomes of crises work differently in different places. We have different worlds of welfare capitalism. We have different worlds of neoliberalism. We have, in contemporary South America, different worlds of potentially post-neoliberalism, because the struggles have gone different ways. And here we don't perhaps need to go through this in great detail, but to say any adequate political history of Europe is a history precisely of these kinds of things. It's a history of the relative strength of the resistance, or the labour movement, or fascism, or the women's movement, and how particular things played out, particular alliances, particular conflicts, and so on. From below then, what are we talking about? The argument that we make is one which says we need to think about movement as process rather than a particular kind of agency, that it's a developmental process. This developmental process, in some senses, is what is embedded in an experienced activist's ABC, the sense of what movements can become and the sense of what the potential for something looks like before it actually happens. Yeah? Now, there are problems intellectually and academically with the concept of potential, but any experienced political actor, any experienced movement actor is working with the notion of potential all the time. They are saying both, can we take this further in a small sense, but also, is there scope for taking this further in a big sense? And could we hope to see new things coming up? That does not, of course, mean that it's teleological. Movements from above will very often do their best to demobilize movements from below. All sorts of blockages, particularisms, clientelisms, and so on come into play. There's nothing, Lukács presented a very teleological version of this, but there needs to be nothing teleological about saying movements can and sometimes do become more than they are when we observe them. And awareness of that fact is an absolutely central one for strategic movement actors and their opponents. People are aware of this. Yeah? And they're aware of it in all sorts of different ways. Yeah? When the British Empire pulled the flag down and left Asia, they didn't fight nationalist movements to a standstill in most countries. Yeah, in a couple they did. But in a lot of them, they kind of looked at it and went, okay, I think we've kind of lost here. Let's go before we're kicked out. Right? And being slightly cynical, but that kind of logic is very normal to social actors because of the costs of conflict. So in terms of movements from below, we start with a very situated practice. We start with our needs. We start by trying to meet our human needs within extremely concrete circumstances, the mediation of many, many different determinations. Out of that, at times, we abstract what in this book we call a local rationality, so something which is adequate, more or less adequate, to those needs, to that situation, and which has a certain coherence to it, a certain abstractness to it, that you can start to call culture. At times, in conflict or under threat, such rationalities are mobilized as David Harvey and Raymond Williams called militant particularism. Every activist then knows that part of the ABC is to sew those militant particularisms together into broader campaigns. We sometimes forget this when we talk about the past. We talk about the workers' movement as though it was sort of automatically there and homogeneous, rather than an immensely complex achievement which looked very different in different times and places, because it was actually extremely difficult to get all these different kinds of people and struggle together, and to even pretend that they were talking about the same thing and to collaborate was not easy. At times again, rarely but significantly, such campaigns can develop into social movement projects. The word neoliberalism is in some ways best understood globally at the moment as a tool for doing this. I was very like many English speakers, I was very skeptical when this word came to the English language, because I thought, yeah, that'll work in Latin America, it might work in France, we don't like it. But what it has done for us, as in Latin America, is to enable different movements to recognize each other by saying, yeah, the opponent we are up against is one and the same thing. Yeah? It's not purely an intellectual term of economic analysis, it's a term of alliance building. And at times, as in South America, we've actually been able to produce substantial organic crises with that concept. Now, I'll leave aside the question of Burma because I'm sure time is flying. I want to use, in the final 5 minutes or so, to talk about the problems that neoliberalism is having from this perspective. And I think it is having problems, rather against one of the difficulties of an academic logic, is that within academia you can look both profound and radical by describing the way things are as irretrievably bad at such a deep level that only you and a handful of initiates can even understand how bad they are, and far be it from any actual social actors to be able to do anything about it. Right? That's not a very helpful political logic. I'm not convinced that it's a very helpful intellectual logic either. The US's backyard in South America is looking much less like the US's backyard than it has done for a very, very long time indeed. Part of the important story of the Arab Spring as well is the less direct purchase that the US turned out to have on those, again, rather strategically central client states. It's had to back off. It is less able to say, go here, do there. That's not insignificant. Here in Europe, the EU can only keep going by regularly suspending its own democratic rules for legitimacy, rerunning referenda, installing technical governments, twisting the arms of governments elected on one manifesto to do something else. It's a little bit of a problem. The model is not working so well. And indeed, the big international financial agreements are not looking so healthy either. We're seeing this around TTIP as well. It's not, it is not this juggernaut that drives all before it. In fact, these things are rather vulnerable. Furthermore, from the point of view of the neoliberal model, as a form of hegemonic direction, it has some weaknesses. Climate change may not be so much of a problem for the oil industry, but it's a big problem for an awful lot of other industries. There's an awful lot of fixed plant, very, very close to oceans. Right? The insurance industry has a real problem. The building industry, etc. As a long-term strategy for capital accumulation, their inability to deal with climate change doesn't convince very well. But also, the financial crisis has hit many of their previous supporters. So the same British and American middle classes, who did very well out of Thatcher and Reagan, thank you very much, are not looking so happy now. Yeah? Their kids are either not going to college or are coming out of college with absolutely enormous debts. And I think it's no coincidence that it's particularly in those circles that the legitimacy crisis around surveillance issues has become particularly intense. In the European context more generally, and we could say more about this in the global context, the lack of flexibility in dealing with the financial crisis has been quite striking. If you think of the previous global crisis, or between, say, the mid-60s and the mid-70s, there was a new elite strategy waiting in the wings, building up force, what we now call neoliberalism. They don't have that right now. Attempts from within the consensus to say we could do something else have been not even so much shot down as typically politely ignored. So the long-term sustainability of an elite strategy which largely says, well, we're going to cross our fingers and hope that carrying on as before works with very little marginal tinkering, is perhaps not so convincing. Now, from the other side, over really quite a long wave, now going back to the mid-1990s, but increasingly from the 2000s, we've seen substantial disruptions to neoliberal hegemony, not only in economic forms, but also in geopolitical forms and so on in Latin America. Western Europe too has had a comparable level of continuity, albeit not a comparable intensity. It hasn't managed to shift power relations at a national scale up to this point. And in some ways, what characterizes the European situation we've thought of is this encounter between the irresistible force and the immovable object. This has been very, very interesting watching the Greek standoff. The real difficulty in both on Syriza's part in making the breach that they wanted to, but also on the EU's part in reasserting power relations. Of course, it was ever thus. If you look at the history of 1968, the European resistance, the movement wave between 1916 and 1923, 1848, the Atlantic revolutions, you find very similar patterns. It's not that the same thing happens everywhere with equal force. It's that in one or two regions of the world system, there's a substantial disruption to hegemony, which makes it clear that sooner or later things need to be readjusted. To finish off with this parallel that's been widely made between Greece, Spain, and Ireland, European elites seem to have a difficulty in squaring the circle. On the one hand, insisting on the letter of the law, the German strategy. On the other hand, how to maintain popular consent. In both cases, with an eye to what will people do if they see that the Greeks can win something, or conversely, what will people do if they see that it doesn't matter even what government you vote in. So the frozen agency there is quite significant. One sees this particularly, in fact, following union discussions. Now, what perhaps I'll just finish on is to say, this is where social movement studies really has something to offer, because an analysis that says, well, what Greece, Spain, and Ireland have in common is austerity and poverty. Yeah, but so do Portugal and Italy, and in other ways, quite a number of European countries. It's not the economics that explains the dramatic changes there, nor is it events within the party system, because Syriza may be a classic party with a very traditionalist left-wing genealogy. That's not true for Podemos. Podemos was invented on the back of an envelope by a pack of autonomists who hated political parties 3 years back. And in Ireland, we have a very different situation again. What they do all have in common is an absolutely massive social movement mobilization. And I think as social movement researchers, this is what we should be talking about, both that commonality, but also the relationship between that mobilization and the freezing of agency elsewhere in the periphery and rather differently in the European core, and how that European situation relates to situations elsewhere, most visibly the Latin American. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your patience.
Right, thank you very much. Because we have plenty of time for a good discussion. So I know that actually all of you received a text of the third chapter. I hope that some of you had some time to read it and have some good questions. I have plenty of good questions, but I actually start by some of you. So, donc c'est évidemment possible de poser des questions en français, ce qui peut faciliter la tâche. Et ça peut être tant des commentaires généraux que des questions, par rapport à vos recherches.
Sorry for English, but I definitely understand your point.
Okay.
Yes, because what is theory for you? I didn't understand what you you think about contradiction in this history. And I would like I would like to see you explain more directly what is your point in criticizing movement, social movement. Because if I arrive to understand your point, there is no significant gains when we talk about social movement in history. Is that you'd like to say?
No, I don't think so. My critique is not a critique of social movements. It's a critique of the dominant form of social movement studies. Very different thing.
Maybe we can gather a few questions. What was studied or?
No, I would like to see specifically what is the critique you demonstrate against social movement in make history. I didn't understand.
Actually, his point is that social movement make history. So.
I didn't understand that. Because I think that is a relativist point of the gains of social movement. I would like to understand in your intervention.
Actually, Hollis talks about that, but you may gather
take some
maybe
questions
some more
and
questions. Yes,
See if we can come back to this productively.
yes, and if not, then I may add one or two to give people time to think about it. Actually, I have a few questions. What's really interesting is that you actually it's of course it's a reasonably Marxist perspective. That's even the first word of the subtitle, but at the same time, it's a book against, first of all, against current dominant social movement studies for sure, because it's far too new perspective, which I definitely share. It's far too specialized. So it happened that we work many social scientists just work a bit outside of social movements and on very specific point. With maybe you haven't underlined it very much in your talk, but having in mind that the way for a social movement to win is actually to have an impact on the political process. So people see in social movement studies usually see the impact and evaluate social movements with a very institutionalized political perspective. And so that's a very good part in your book, which is called What Does It Mean for a Movement to Win? So if you could maybe develop a bit on that, this would be one of the questions. And then to carry on, it's definitely a very strong attack on current dominant social movement studies on this side, bringing the big questions back in, the relations activists, but also, isn't it also an attack, and at least as strong, against usual Marxism? You haven't developed it here, but in this brilliant book, you also explain that part of Marxism, and also, I mean, some of brilliant colleagues may write a book entitled Social Movements or something, and then at the end they talk about something quite different and may bring the social movement in the last page. I remember to talk about one of our most brilliant, person of this house, Min Wallerstein, who was a guest in this very same room a year ago. I once asked him what was the impact, because he's going to each and every World Social Forum. And so I asked him, well, it seems to be quite different from what you say about structure. And he said, I've studied structure too much to believe that this kind of movement will have a real impact. So that's quite an attack on that. So is it still Marxism, and why is it important for you to bring this into the Marxist perspective, or is it like something between social movement studies and Marxism? This would be a second question. And the third one, and last one for this time, is actually about the definition of social movements. So you retake in your talk Tilly's, actually, Tilly's, one of Tilly's definition. He says the main I don't know the exact word in English or in French. The main challenge for social movements is actually to build an alliance between very different small struggles. That's in the conclusion of his book on revolts in French. How is it? I don't remember the title in English nor in French. Anyway, but alliance building, that's something activists are very aware of and very strong over there. But you bring another point, emphasizing social movements as agents and as a process, and also actors who contribute to historicity. And may I ask you to, sorry to forget, on page 57 of this brilliant book, when you talk your definition of social movements, if you could come back to it, maybe I won't read it, but maybe you could come back to it again. It's over here, and you probably will develop it. So the question is, of course, this challenge of bringing together a wide range of actors, quite different actors, is really important in social movements, alliance building. But how do you connect that with the importance you give to historicity in social movements? I mean, how do you connect the definition of social movements to historicity, and also the building of a unity of a social movements, which is not only in terms of alliance, but also in terms of historicity? So, 3 small questions.
Okay. Right,
there was one more question. Is it somehow connected, or should we keep it for a second round? 2 questions at least.
Let's take them.
Let's take all together.
Yeah.
It may also be a contribution to debate, of course.
Yeah, I mean,
Please
it
go ahead.
follows really from what you said, so maybe
Okay.
amongst ourselves, we're all experts in the room. We've all lived in this fucked up society, have a critique. We're on telly as well. Oh my goodness, I'll hide behind you. So, I mean, one thing I have a problem with classical social movement studies as the division of labor that they imagine between the social and the political. And it becomes normalized. Oh, these are how social movements make history in normal times. Maybe the American Black Civil Rights Movement becomes the paradigm for all post-war social movements. And they have, as you say, an impact on the political. They do their job in the division of labor, in the social sphere, changing cultural norms and etc. And then eventually politicians respond. And I think this is a really inhibiting division of labor. Yet this division of labor confronts us now with this seeming move from the great social upheavals of 2011 and this move towards Podemos and Syriza. This move from the social movement mode to the political party mode, which just happened before our eyes. And I've noticed so many people are quite happy with this division of labor. So this has happened in the UK as well with the Green Party. See, all the kind of people I met in Occupy in 2011 with their anti-political stuff are now in the Green Party, and yet they don't seem to have taken their radical autonomist style and their criticality to the political into it. Some friends were then justifying the local Green Council in Brighton attacking the refuse workers. There was a strike, and they said, well, what do you expect? And this weird division of labor between the demand the impossible of the social movements. And then, of course, with Syriza, we see, the real problems when you take office in a capitalist society, all the chains. I'm not rejecting that strategy, but we can't be uncritical. And so it's really what, I don't know how to pronounce his name so well, I've just moved to Paris, but the recently deceased Trotskyist theoretician, Daniel Ben-Sai, how do you say?
Yeah, like
Okay,
that.
and he, his critique of the social illusion. So this moves on to my real question is the problematic, how do we talk of the working class today? And it really feels like it's missing. And we've had, this is not unexpected since Eric Hobsbawm, The Forward March of Labour Halted, or Andre Gort's Farewell to the Proletariat. This has become boring. Everybody says the working class is dead. It's not radical. No one's an enfant terrible if you say this anymore. It's what old 68ers say as they die. But in, even in Egypt, which was the highest peak in the cycle of struggle in this crisis, and the working class did play a significant role. And in Greece, where there's been 32 general strikes, it's still, we assemble in the squares and the streets, and our subjectivity, the formation places in the square, and then the ballot box, and not the workplace. It plays a subordinate role. The organized working class haven't put themselves at the center of a hegemonic bloc, which can then pull all the other popular movements around. And so in the absence of that, all we have is left populism. We are the people again. From the third estate, we are the 99%. Or more darkly, we are the nation. And it seems what's missing is this autonomous agency, not as the working class defining itself, oh, we're different from this people, but being able to lead this people and therefore make it immune to the populist, nationalist demagoguery, which will otherwise. And so you talk of like this achievement of sewing together the working class, how in 1889 with the new unionism it had to overcome the nationalist division Marx had noticed between the English chauvinists and the Irish nationalists, and to forge a working class and the dots in 1889. But that almost seemed a bit more natural or organic. It's been trying to drag a corpse to try, and I've been trying to, my hope is we recreate something called the working class, but on a global scale. It might not be known as, of course it can't happen because of the nationalism. But there, you talk about the particular and the universal, and how Zizek talks about how sometimes something particular stands in, and everyone, yeah, that is all of us. So it could be a strike, and everyone goes, yes, and this is what happened with the match girls in 1889. But that doesn't seem to happen. It seems to appear as another section. And so when we have the pension strikes in Britain, it almost pulled the anti-austerity movement behind it, but was trapped into a particularism. We rich academics want to defend our pensions, and most of the workers don't have a pension. So that remained trapped. I hope you can find a question in there somewhere.
I'll do the best.
It's a very good point. Also, that could have been done on the Arab revolutions with the department of workers' movement. That's a very good point. Just a question, just to know where you are talking from.
I now live in Paris. I'm a fellow here at a university.
Oh,
Just
excellent.
moved here from Bolivia.
From
where I
Berlin.
was a fellow
Okay.
here. I'm doing a grand intellectual tour of Europe.
Excellent. Here at the Collège Études Mondiales? Oh,
Yeah.
excellent. So we have to carry on this debate many
Yeah.
times. It's also a question.
I have a quick question.
If you could also quickly, sorry, to introduce yourself.
Yeah,
It might
okay.
overlap with what
Go ahead.
the others have said. You're following the
Sure.
so I apologize if it's a repetition of what the others have said. Basically, you had mentioned in your speech that we're living in a period of crisis, and how do you contextualize sort of the Occupy movement, and sort of its sort of its contributions to social movement theory making vis-a-vis the practitioners and activists in your discussion today? And in terms of historical actors, are there any historical actors that you could say that are emerging in terms of this movement? Are we looking at it as a process, or sort of as a failed sort of movement that hasn't accomplished its? That's
Right, okay.
Good question.
All
So,
right. Wow.
anything to
Well, yeah, and let's start with Occupy. I think names are in some ways the least important aspects of social movements, and movements often don't recognize themselves in the names that they're given, either by their opponents or by posterity. That's fine, yeah. And, something of this is true for the working class as well. There have been periods when people have thought of themselves in that way. But it's not true, for example, for the Paris Commune. That's not the primary, but it's unarguably, one of the most powerful political working class moments in Western European history. And one, incidentally, in which the workplace was not so important. So I'm quite wary of any kind of analysis which says things have to proceed from an aim or a place. There is a thing. And when people say to me, we can't be living in a moment of global movements because everybody isn't saying the same thing, I say to them, you don't actually know what the history of such a movement in the past looks like. You're thinking of Coca-Cola's advertising campaign, where they roll out the same slogan and the same image with a different translation in lots of different countries simultaneously. That's not what a movement wave looks like. A movement wave looks much more like, for example, in many countries in Latin America, Western Europe, South Africa, and India in the late 1990s, an awful lot of people recognized themselves in these strange Mexican indigenous movements who are telling everybody very firmly, we don't want you to follow us. And at the same time, we are open for everything. So I think we need to be wary of a simple logic there. In terms of Occupy, what struck me looking at Occupy, looking at the Indignados and so on, but specifically Occupy, it has a very particular geography. It's very significant in some countries, really irrelevant in others. That's not to denigrate it. It's to say one of the really important things, let's say, of Occupy in the US is that it brings together some of the coalitions which had been broken in the repression and nationalism of the Bush years. Because Americans and Australians will tell us about the decline of movements after 9/11 as though this was a global factor. I think, well, no, that's not true for us. Certainly not true for Western Europe. But some of those links are then remade, I think, particularly around Occupy and in some key sites, New York, obviously, Oakland, and so on, where there's a coalition around class, around race, where central gender issues come into play, and where you see people engaging in other social movements beyond themselves, where it's certainly a cockpit moment. It's a moment in which everybody's looking on, but then it feeds into other things. It's strategically central there. And I think it's, to some degree, that kind of analysis which, on the one hand, situates US Occupy within an American history, and on the other hand says, how do we understand that American wave in relation, let's say, to West European anti-austerity movements or Latin American movements against neoliberalism? How do we think of these things in what Trotsky talked about, sort of uneven and combined development? That different global regions are in part defined not just by a different role in the world economy, but by different relations of power. And something happened in Occupy in the Anglo-American sphere, which is clearly very, very central. I'm not sure we fully understood it yet, I have to say, in that context. And in Ireland, it's very peculiar again. We had very, very long Occupy movement, extraordinarily long in Ireland, and in tiny, tiny towns. And then it vanished, but something remained, and we know that kind of thing can happen. Now, try and say something about the political. In the book, we make a joke about Gramsci and the modern prince. Gramsci said that, the party was the modern prince and it was to bring everybody together and so on and so forth. And it often seems that for a particular kind of Marxist, what they're actually looking for is Prince Charming. That you can only be a proper Marxist if somewhere else, ideally, there is a party that you can really believe in. That you can point to Syriza or Chavez or whatever it is and say, there, that shows that what I'm doing means something. You know, in much the same way there's certain kind of Catholic talks about Medjugorje or Lourdes or whatever. You know, there has been a moment in which the transcendental has entered this world. I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about political parties at all. And in relation to, so as between parties and movements, I think the key question that Marxists should be asking of political parties is to what extent they are an adequate expression of the movement or even a part of it, which is not very different to the question that one might ask about the cultural and artistic forms associated with a movement, the production of media, the money aspect of it, or for that matter in much of the world and much of human history, the military aspect. We regularly see any of these aspects taking on a life of their own, coming to dominate the movements themselves as an alien force. That experience is very common, and of course there's a powerful logic to it. If movements think of themselves as trying to enter a different sphere and having to place all of their energies in that sphere, it's quite normal that, be it the logic of the parliament or the logic of the guerrilla war or the logic of winning the battle of mainstream opinion, or however one conceives of it, actually comes to dominate. And also quite often that a logic of demobilization enters into it. You know, that people say, well, they're doing it. You know, be it you know, some popular cultural figure, be it a guerrilla army, be it a bunch of nice guys in suits entering parliament. It doesn't really matter very much if people are allowed, are willing to allow them to be the actors. And this is where I think the Latin American experience is particularly important for Europe, because what we see there is a very wide range of relationships between, on the one hand, parties, left parties that clearly wouldn't be in power without the upheavals of the last 15 years, but whose relationships to those movements vary from, you know, pretty hostile to many people in the movement are willing to go along with the party, but quite a lot actually aren't. There is a very, very wide range of relationships there, and I think this will be true in Europe as well, not least because our movements have different histories of relationships to the political, and you can't avoid that. You can't get away from the fact that, say, Greeks, Spanish, and Irish think about what a real movement is, what it should look like in the political sphere in radically different ways. Go
on. I suppose it's the role of the political encounter in transforming the social movement. It needn't always be in the way of demobilization. You know, I'm thinking of when Marx said, you know, the working class only comes together as a class movement when it makes a demand on the ruling class, like the 8-hour day, when it's not just, you know, a lot of Marxists today, or since the 1960s, have had a social romantic illusion that the workplace struggle in itself will generate this class consciousness. But Marx said, even with a class consciousness can only come about by placing a demand on the state in that dialectic between the social and the political. So now we're seeing it's like there's this feeling, or the popular narrative is that the 2011 cycle of grassroots struggle failed to shift the austerity trajectory. Now we have to enter the political. But it seems to be performing this old division of labor I don't like. And I'm wondering if there can be a way of using the political, the ballot box, but not with the idea of forming a government, but precisely with the idea of strengthening the social movement. Instead of turning protests into votes, to also try and turn votes back into protests.
Okay.
But that's a kind of Leninist model in a way.
Well, let me try and come back to bring this back to some of Jeffrey's questions, which I think go in this same direction. In terms of the impacts of movements on political processes, once again, I'm not willing, I suppose, to fetishize one particular thing. The reason I'm not willing to do that is I'm going to say that the different kinds of things that we're fetishizing in these discussions are themselves historical products. So the political party, when Marx writes a book called The Manifesto of the Communist Party, there is nothing that we would recognize as a party there. It means faction or tendency. It's the working class movement that invents the modern political party in the form of the SPD. We then see very different forms, of course, in the Bolshevik Party, which is nothing like the SPD, or the post-war catch-all party, or the very strange thing which people who like horror movies watch what's happened, say, to the Italian PDs. It's a party, but not as we know it. So to reify any of these terms, the party, the parliament, as though party and parliament mean the same thing now as they did 50 or 100 years ago, is clearly a mistake. Part of the question has to be to ask, at the moment, in a specific context, what do these things actually mean in terms of our agency and their agency? I think that demystifying moment, that move away from codifying, so this is your answer in terms of kinds of Marxism. I think the difficulty in recent years in particular has been that Marxism, like canonical social movement studies, it's become a form of intellectual capital. It's something that you invest in either within very peculiar corners of the academy or within very peculiar political organizations. It is not, by and large, something that people use to have effective dialogues with movements for social change. It's much more about asserting the validity of your own cultural capital, which to me is politically irresponsible, but it's also intellectually a failure. If you admit that really what I'm trying to do is to sell you a new theory, that's why I'm not going to offer our definition of social movements. I mean, please, Jeffrey. We have one, but for the purposes of having a conversation, rather than for the purposes of creating a new school of people who parrot, a social movement is X. The usefulness, the value of a theory, and this comes back to your question, is precisely, can you do something with it? Can you make it work in empirical research, in political practice? And this, it's also a choice, if you like, of different Marxes, is to say that the Marx who is really powerful in this respect is, for example, the Marx of the Manifesto or the 18th Brumaire, where you can see that theory doing incredible things, rather more so than, the Marx of the Grundrisse or whatever, where you can see that theory becoming a very particular world apart, which, absent other power relations, has relatively little purchase. Now, if we're going to come to historicity and the sort of step changes, because what we talk about in the book is the way in which people find themselves initially in a materially given situation. They are, for example, Irish landless peasants who happen to be Catholic. They are not yet Catholic nationalists. They are Burmese peasants who happen to be Buddhist. They are not yet Buddhist nationalists. How do you go in, often within less than the space of a lifetime, to a new state, in those cases, made up around ethno-religious identities and all the strengths and weaknesses that come with that? So that making of themselves as a new kind of agent in conflictual dialogue with many, many other kinds of agents, and the development of what we call movement becomes state, which I want to insist is the normal situation of a state in the world today. Okay? There are states which are not the product of social movements and do not claim social movements as their origin and legitimacy. There aren't many of them. And obviously, in some cases, that legitimacy is fairly rhetorical. But in most states in the world today, this is a matter of living memory. This is not the dim and distant past. This is the world we live in. So there's how do you come from absolutely rock bottom to remaking the state? We're seeing this at the moment in the new phase of assertion of the Irish working class, which is happening in people's pajamas and dressing gowns. Yeah? Because they're trying to privatize water. They're introducing water charges. And there was a political campaign. It fell apart in 2013. So there was nothing happening until water vans started turning up on people's streets and installing water meters. And suddenly people started going out in their dressing gowns and standing there and preventing them. And then we started seeing the police coming and some very nasty private security stuff happening. And it's escalated hugely. The state is trembling. I'm not exaggerating. Yeah. There's been delay after delay, concession after concession. They are now trying to bribe us to sign up for this process. They will pay us to agree to be privatized. Absolutely extraordinary. And as yet, this has very little form in the formal political sphere, partly for good Marxist reasons, because the argument both that Marx makes in relation to the Paris Commune, but also the practical argument that Lenin makes in relation to peace, land, bread, the Soviets, and so on, is one thing is your relationship to the existing political system, another is the space in which you construct a different kind of world, including a different kind of political self-representation. Now, as I say, that's not a normal event. This is not an event in normal historical periods, but it's a very regular event in world history. It's the kind of event that gives rise to a new kind of state, that gives rise to a national state as against an empire, to a democracy as against a dictatorship, to a welfare state as against robber baron capitalism. And depending on where you are, it may be easier or harder to see. So where I teach, we're literally teaching on the rubble of the Catholic Church's hegemony. And that power was enormous when I was growing up. It was enormous right into my 30s. It's vanishing, like old Stalinists are vanishing from many ex-socialist states. I don't see a priest from one end of the day to the next. People are embarrassed to call themselves Catholic. But if you look a little bit beneath that, the world that they replaced, the world of a Protestant landed gentry, you have to have a historical guidebook to tell you what you're looking at to even find it. Right? That's a common enough experience walking around any major European city with a little bit of an eye.
Okay, so we still have time for another round of questions. En français, ou si vous voulez, aussi des questions. Vous voulez en arabe, par exemple. Question. Actually, there was still this question that was also reminded by Japanese colleagues. He was from the University of Tokyo. He asked the answer about this question about social movement having success.
Yeah.
So if you could maybe say a few words on that. What does it mean for a social movement to win?
Social movement success. You can win at different levels, can't you? Yeah. One can win at very, very different levels. Much of the meat and drink of US canonical social movement theory consists in identifying what in the book we call a game board, a relatively known set of rules within which one is trying to carry out a fairly familiar operation, and you could actually produce a board game of it quite easily. Yeah? It's not that you always know the outcome in advance, but you're pretty clear, if you're anyway experienced and institutionalized, what you're doing, what you're up against, how it's going to work. Now, even having said that, sometimes players get it wrong, An instance that I'm quite interested in at the moment is the attempt of the religious right in a variety of countries to make an issue out of gay marriage. Because in the US, in Italy, in Ireland, the religious right thought, yeah, gay marriage is something that people will line up behind us on. Not just we're opposed to it in general, but we're going to invest in opposing it. It will be strategically worthwhile fighting this battle because we're going to win. And transpired they were wrong, yeah? Or rather, they were right on the immediate level, that quite often, first off, when you ask people about it, they said, oh, gay marriage, but marriage isn't, yeah, marriage is between a man and a woman or whatever. But actually, it didn't take very long for that to shift, because other power relations elsewhere in the culture had shifted to such an extent that that particular set of beliefs was actually rather fragile. So the game board didn't work the way the religious right thought it did, because it wasn't actually as isolated as one imagines it. It was not business as usual in a sense. So at least in those countries, it's proved quite a strategic defeat for them, which is kind of interesting, and would then, if the pro-gay marriage forces were not themselves so institutionalized, might raise bigger questions about, well, what else can we do if we've just defeated them on this? Where else can we move forward? Have other things suddenly become possible in terms of challenging patriarchy that we'd given up on worrying about within our particular kinds of spaces? So that's one level at which one can imagine, a win within a game sphere, or which only involves moving slightly outside it. There are also, this is very familiar, isn't it, from the history of huge movements. Sometimes you are defeated immediately, but you have in fact won in the long term. Right? I take the example of the Paris Commune. Yeah? Within a very few years after its repression, there's an amnesty. And much of the agenda, notably around secular education, has actually been taken on board. Not the most radical part of the agenda, but the permanent defeat of the monarchist right. Okay? So, one can win a battle and lose the war, or lose a battle and win the war, and that's extremely common. Because what is important in this big perspective is not simply the issue. It's not simply the event. It's what people do with it. So I'll give two examples of that. Firstly, in relation to Syriza, I think it is immensely more important, certainly for those of us outside Greece, not how one in some objective sense might interpret the eventual agreement, but how other Europeans interpret it. Yeah? If people in Spain, Ireland, for that matter, Portugal, Italy, who knows, even France and Britain, say, oh, look, there is an alternative. Yeah? The Greeks did stand up to them and they won something. That's a hugely important political fact. Conversely, if it's possible to convince people actually that the Greeks have been defeated, that will be a hugely important political fact. Yeah? Irrespective, obviously, interpretations are shaped by what objective facts you can draw, but the politically important assessments are not made in a technical way. Yeah? They're made in the belief, yeah, they've done something really important, or, oh no, they tried it and they lost. Yeah? So in terms of winning and losing, that's really important when you think of the degree of frozen agency in these other systems. And we were talking earlier about, say, the German trade unionists' appeal, because while the SPD came out to support Merkel, German trade unionists were saying something rather different. And of course, there is huge political potential if significant chunks of the European trade union left say, actually, this Greek strategy is significant. That's really, really important politically. The other example I'd give is in relation to Irish water charges. We have been, as social movement activists, really depressed in Ireland since about 2007. We fought one losing battle after another. We've now seen so much action, massive direct resistance. There are whole areas of the banlieue that the police and the water meters can't go. Only about 40% of the population is agreeing to be registered for this campaign. The government parties are in freefall. Almost, it doesn't matter whether we win or lose on the issue at that point. I don't mean it doesn't matter at all, of course it does. But we have actually scored a huge success simply by becoming active as a political agent. And as a political agent which allies long-standing working class community organizing with other elements of the social movement left. So if you think in these terms, you are again getting away from treating the language of any particular space with more respect than it deserves. I don't mean ignoring the specific specificities of any particular thing, but seeing it in a bigger perspective and saying, what does this mean in terms of our collective agency and their collective agency, translating it back into that bigger question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, some additional questions. Because actually, I would like to suggest you ask always, or maybe I'll change to French. Je vous propose de faire comme d'habitude, de poursuivre la discussion un peu plus tôt cette fois-ci, mais dans le café du coin qu'on voit là-bas, dans une ambiance plus conviviale. Et j'aimerais juste vous inviter pour la prochaine séance qui a lieu très bientôt, dans 9 jours, donc le 17 mars, une séance tout aussi intéressante. On accueillera pour cette fois-là Keith Hart, qui est donc professeur à la London School of Economics. Ce sera également en anglais. Le titre c'est Africa, the Coming Evolutions. Et c'est vraiment intéressant de voir. I don't know, should I carry on in English? Is French okay for everyone? En français, ça va?
Je n'en comprends.
Oh, yeah. So let me. I think that next one will be really an interesting one because Keith Hart is a brilliant professor, anthropologist. He's the one who coined in the 1970s the word informal economy, and then he's now in the last 5 to 10 years he spent half of the year in South Africa, and he's got really local knowledge of that. And when I asked him to. I'm going to propose him to choose any title, talking about Africa, and people think that we have to put Africa much more on a map. And I'm really glad that in the mark of this research committee, the ISA 47 really tried to push Africa much more. And also, I think for the Collectif Mondial also, it will be very important to have a good session on Africa. So we'll have 2 hours with Keith Hart. I have invited Michel Vivoca, who will be the discussant. And then we cannot have a good session on Africa without African students. So then at the end, we'll have 1 hour on 2 students from Cameroon who will tell us a bit more about imaginaries and social movements in Cameroon. And imagination is definitely, if you read this fantastic book by Lawrence and Alf Gunvald, it's really, you see how important imagination is, and you also saw it in his answers. So I definitely think that this kind of perspective where the world vision, imagination is important in struggle. It's part of the battlefield, and also somewhere where movements, actors, subjects are building with themselves is really important. And to switch on the African continent, I'm convinced we have many things to learn from these people. So hope you'll all join us on the 17th of March in 11 days. Hope you'll all join us right now for a few drinks just over there, on the bar just over there. And thank you very much, Lawrence, for this brilliant talk. And so please go back to this excellent book.
Thank you for your time.
Say goodbye.
Thank you. I hope that came across.
Yeah.